Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you had an opportunity to stretch your legs and grab some food. Introducing next is Alex Lalumiere, who is the National Digital Practice Lead at WSP. WSP is a major multinational engineering firm, offices all over the world, pretty sophisticated operation over there, I'm sure. They're using the ISO 19650, I still can't say it, standard on projects in the Canadian market. So pretty excited to hear about some live case studies and their use of that standard. I'm going to invite Alex to come in. Alex is based in Quebec. He's been working at WSP for 4 years and is responsible for BIM standards development implementation. And he's engaged with this standard. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, I'm going to get out of your way and then I'll come back for Q&A.
Fantastic. All right, so hello everyone. Thanks for attending the presentation. I hope you're all doing very well. I'm very happy to be here with you today to present our use and implementation of ISO 19650 at WSP. So first, quick intro to who is WSP. WSP is one of the world's leading engineering professional service consulting firm. We're pretty much all over the world, over 40 countries. We have 40,000 employee plus in 550 office. This is a very great way to collaborate and share knowledge and expertise on a wide variety of subjects, including ISO 19650. Our Canadian presence. We are 7,000 employees across 150 offices. Our work includes projects such as commercial, education, healthcare, transportation, hospitality. So, small intro, who is speaking today? My name is Alex Lalumiere. I have 9 years of experience. I do have a industrial background, so I joined WSP 4 years ago in the industrial business line, where I was more involved on the production side, but I worked a lot in the coordination and quality of our work to standardize as much as possible our way of working. 2 years ago, I decided to take the opportunity within our building business line, where BIM was a bit more embraced than on the industrial side. So I got back in the BIM management, training and supporting our teams. And WSP decided to create a digital initiative and a team by investing heavily in its own business and created some roles. And I was selected as the National Digital BIM Lead for M&E on the development side. This became a tremendous opportunity to scale the standard I was working on and collaborated with more talented people to have an even better result. So, just a sec. Sorry about that. So where did our journey with ISO 19650 started? When I joined the building group 2 years ago as a BIM manager, I was tasked to support one of our biggest projects to date, the Energy Service Acquisition Program. The scope of the project was very large, and it was easy to get overwhelmed by some aspect of it. But BIM-wise, the requirements were pretty clear, and it wasn't going to be an easy project for its size. So when I joined the team, the project was already at 33% past design development for 2 of the 4 plans that we had to do. BIM Execution Plan was already in place. And interestingly enough, it was aligned with ISO 19650 in some aspect. Our director of technology at the time had made this call to avoid reinventing the wheel and gain some efficiency using the established standard. So after some discussion with the director of technology and reviewing thoroughly the ISO 19650 documents, we agreed that baby steps implementation of a new way of working would be ideal. So the major aspect that we agreed that we should start with was the common data environment. So being able to use ISO 19650 as a backdrop for recommended practice and apply those principles to our project would be of immense value, since we had a large number of models and deliverable almost every week. So it was quite crazy at the time. As I was working my way through updating the BIM Execution Plan and the CDE environment, I quickly realized the benefit it would have on even smaller project to streamline this whole BIM360 and CDE process. So the design collaboration module made it very straightforward to implement the work in progress, shared, published, and archived workflow. It was a good entry point to explain the principle to the rest of the team as well. So while BIM360 and design collaboration are not perfectly aligned with ISO 19650, I tried to see how we could capture the essence and principle of it and apply them to our workflow. So after I tried some ideas and had some very interesting discussion with our discipline lead on the project, I concluded that the share and consume process would be the most aligned with the principle and the most beneficial for a project, basically. There was not much of a choice. For those of you who are familiar with BIM360, there's the infamous live linking method, which means that you're linking Revit files directly to the work in progress folder. The share linking, which made a bit more sense because it was an alignment a lot more with the ISO workflow, and the consume linking, which gave us the most flexibility in terms of the review process. So it wasn't an easy discussion because some of the teams were pretty fond of the live linking method, but live linking was rejected for a couple of reasons other than not aligning with ISO. So for those of you who know the workflow, the lack of review before accepting new change and the risk associated with model corruption, for example, were part of those reasons. The share method was considered as it offered the possibility to review before sharing and ensure the information was accurate, but it lacked the review process before updating a linked model. So that's why we decided to go with the consume method, because it allowed both a way to review before sharing and before accepting the model. So as you can see here, we had to tweak a bit the ISO 19650 process to include the consume process, which is not part of the ISO 19650, but made a lot of sense in BIM360. So this method allowed us as well to create some model freeze that was much needed for the project. If the M&E team needed a model freeze on architecture, for example, we could just stop consuming and not affect the other discipline. So it allowed us as well to reject a model. So in that review process, by just not consuming it or reverting by one version if we saw something in the model that we missed during the review process. So one of the big advantage of that as well was that if you go with the consume process and you revert back one version, you're not going to affect all other discipline because you're just reverting the version in your consume folder. So now that the work in progress and shared were mostly aligned with ISO 19650, we needed to figure a good way to take care of the publish aspect of ISO 19650. It was not extremely hard to comply with, so we decided to simply create a publish folder in BIM360 and use it for delivery milestone. At that point in time, the project had 3 internal submissions prior to the client submission for the review process. So as I said, there was almost a delivery every week. It was quite crazy. We decided that no other layer of automated review was going to be required, and that using the review function in BIM360 would be a future step to implement in our BIM360 workflow. In hindsight, though, I would have loved to add that BIM360 review process, not necessarily to be the place to conduct a review, but simply for traceability and ensure that the documents were placed in the right folder at the right time. So one of the challenges that we had is that, unfortunately, we had 3 platforms, 3 CDE to keep alive. There was the client platform, the internal platform, which was SharePoint, and BIM360. It caused a lot of frustration to some team across the project because there was a lot of confusion as well. It was a lesson learned, and the published workflow had to be defined and structured in better ways. After discussing with many of our team members and experts in our business, we found the obvious: published as a word was not clear. and it didn't reflect our current workflow. So, for example, when we started engaging discussion with people and speaking about publish and explaining that it was basically our submission, they were just questioning why we haven't called that folder submission, which I couldn't really argue with, but we were trying to align as much as possible with ISO 19650 and have that publish setting. So it also caused a lot of confusion because for those of you who are familiar with BIM360, when they were reading the BIM Execution Plan, they were confusing the publish function of Revit to BIM360 with the actual publish folder. So these discussions kind of open a can of worm around the verbiage of ISO 19650, as Clive and Ben have discussed a bit earlier today, but we're very unfamiliar with that verbiage in Canada, so it caused a lot of confusion. But I'll get back to that later. So the other than the CDE, a huge effort was made through the project to deliver a model that would actually contain information. So to me, this is at the art of ISO 19650. If our model has limited to no data in them, it makes them hardly useful for the whole process, other than the good old construction document deliverable. So this might seems like a very obvious point to make, but it was actually a bit more complex, and the level of effort could vary a lot. So one of the example was scheduling in Revit, and that's scheduling with intelligent data. We didn't want to have some of the plugin that would take an Excel spreadsheet and copy it into the header of a Revit schedule, because there's no link in those two schedules. There can be one link that will update your Revit schedule based on the Excel data, but there is no connection between the information of the model element and the actual schedule. So that creates what I like to call dumb data, which is something we're trying to avoid. So for all the schedule, I made sure that the teams were actually using the model element or the intelligent PNID that we had, where it was not possible to use the model, for example, instrumentation, to create them. So what we had to do, the fun part when it comes to the content management and shared perimeter in Revit, I'm sure many of you have struggled with keeping a unified library of content over the years in your office, province, or country. This project was no exception. So we didn't start the project with a unified library. It was more of an industrial project, which was outside of our current content library. So I established a couple of content manager on the M&E side to ensure that the content was vetted before being pulled in a model, or that the user could actually request the content to be built if it was missing from the library that we were establishing throughout the project. Our structure and architecture team were already standardized, so the need for that content process was not there. It made our task a lot easier. So even though this process was in place, we had to purge and clean the model on a weekly basis. At one point, I even decided to sacrifice 2 days worth of work by deleting some of the unvetted content. I didn't make much friend, but the message was clear enough to improve the situation a bit. And people decided to play a bit more by the book and pay attention to the information in the model. So with time, we saw an increasing need to start building a national library and national standard for content and detail. If we wanted to achieve a solid information model, in discussion with some other of our business experts and leaders, we realized that we also needed to get our basic right to progress further in our digital transformation. So all the planets did align around the same time. WSP Building decided to do a big investment and to build the digital practice team. So this team is composed of subject matter expert divided between development and deployment. The goal at a very high level is to improve our digital delivery and orient our project toward a better BIM workflow. So I was fortunate enough to be selected as the National Digital Practice Lead for BIM development on the ME side. This allowed me to revisit my work on ESAP and see what I could improve and scale to the old business line. Since one of our goals was to go to our digital delivery, we decided to pick BIM360 as our cloud platform to host our project. Obviously, on the building side, we're more on the horizontal, so we don't have the same limitation that the linear team would have when it comes to Civil 3D or other software that they might use. So my role became to standardize our approach to the CDE and make it scalable and efficient. I also wanted to make sure that the foundation of the project would be taken care of by establishing a BIM Execution Plan, LOD Matrix template, and Model Coordination template to be used on most projects. So, of course, every project would need their BIM Execution Plan to be tweaked and modified, but having a template to start with wouldn't hurt. And most of these tasks could be aligned with ISO 19650, which I was preaching for a while, so it was a great opportunity to dive deeper. Sorry, just went too far. Sorry about that. First, I wanted to address the BIM Execution Plan. I didn't know exactly where to start to make it scale well across all type of project, and I wanted to make sure that it would scale for a small or large project. So I decided to go all in and create a very long and very thorough document that would cover as much as possible all building project. I opted to ask my global colleague within WSP what they had as a template and ended up with around 10 of them. They range from even longer than what I already had or to very short and concise. But this was a very good exercise. And through that exercise, I ended up adding even more to my own BEP because there was so much fantastic idea around the world that there were things that I just missed in creating my own. So my thinking was it's always easier to remove than to add. But this wasn't received so well. Some found it very overwhelming and feared that because of the length, it would just gather dust in a folder in BIM360 or SharePoint. So I had to revise my approach a bit to ensure it was scalable and that the content of the BEP itself would go well with everyone. So the content itself wasn't that much of a big deal, but the adoption of the content and the adoption of the idea of the BIM Execution Plan was a bit more of an issue at first. So I needed a way to share this information without it becoming overwhelming for our team. And that's when I decided to jump into Planary. So props to Clive and his team for the platform. It's a fantastic platform. We had used it for a project before, and the collaborative approach of the plan section made it an ideal space for my kind of headquarter for my own development and documentation. Plus, to my surprise, they had just released some ISO 19650 template, and not only for the BIM Execution Plan, but for the OIR, PIR, EIR. And this was kind of an opening eye moment for me. I checked their BEP template, and it was mostly a small and concise section. And I realized that this is what I've been missing. I needed to separate my BIM Execution Plan into much smaller section and be a bit more granular. And the Planary libraries and the way that the platform handled them made it actually easier to add than to remove. So in this environment, it became easier to justify having more in the template for users to pick what they needed. So the other eye-opening moment was the OIR, PIR, and EIR template. This is what I needed to align my BIM Execution Plan with ISO 19650. And I was a bit more focused on the BIM Execution Plan itself. Unfortunately, in Canada, I haven't found a client that deliver an exchange information requirement document supported by the project information requirement to answer the organizational information requirement. This part of the ISO 19650 structure is kind of missing, and based on my experience, at least, it's very different in our project. So we would typically receive an RFP that may explain BIM requirement in one or many documents. And while it doesn't make the BIM execution plan impossible, it seems to make it a bit harder to accomplish and make sure that all the client requirements are well understood and clearly answered in the BIM execution plan. So to help alleviate this risk, I decided to borrow a great and simple idea from one of our team in the UK, and I incorporated a mapping table. So this mapping table simply identify on the left where the client requirements are, and on the right where is the answer in our BIM execution plan. So due to that lack of exchange information requirement, or at least the lack of structure in it, I felt like the mapping table was easier to use. So even on some project, we had a mapping table for document ABC, a mapping table for document XYZ, because we had so many documents that had small portion of BIM requirement in them that it makes it very, very complicated to make sure that you don't miss anything. Oops, went one too far again. So after a little while, I ended up with the BIM Execution Template that was visible to all experts in our business, nationally and globally, and easily usable in future projects. It is exhaustive enough to cover most client requirements, but concise enough that it doesn't become overwhelming. With time, we will expand even more and keep alignment with ISO 19650 where possible, adding even more idea. I think each time we work with a different company, a new contractor, they add some amazing ideas, and some of them are in line with ISO 19650. So it's always a pleasure to just keep that BIM execution plan growing. So another item to standardize was our CD environment, and it was again, I was very fortunate to have the support of a BIM360 team of expert and a consultant from Autodesk to help us. So our first goal was to build the structure, the folder structure, and we wanted to have something simple, intuitive, and that promoted ISO 19650. So it was mostly established during the ESAP project and other project that the BIM360 team had worked on. But everybody agreed that we needed that, and we needed to refine it just a bit to make it clearer. So at least one point where everybody was in line was with design collaboration and the work in progress, shared, published, and archive. And of course, we still had discussion around the workflow for naming the folders, for example. But we did come with an agreement and make a lot of improvement to the initial solution that we had. We also decided that as a baby step, only the BIM model and relative information would live in the CD BIM360 environment. Our quality team at WSP already have a quite exhaustive SharePoint folder structure where we would use it as a support CDE for all other documentation. In order to achieve an efficient implementation of BIM360 and the ISO 19650 solution, we had to look at some other aspect that can be very time-consuming as well in BIM360. And one of those examples would be the permission folder based on roles and company. This can take a little eternity to set up on your project. So what we did is we ended up standardizing with some roles and permission directly in a template file. And to standardize that, we tried to align with ISO 19650 for the roles, which we decided to take the roles simply because you can assign 2 roles to one person. So if you're an engineer, for example, and a project manager, made us easier and more flexible to assign those permission to the individual. So we ended up with a quite exhaustive matrix for roles and permission. We tried to create the roles based on ISO 19650, based on the appointing, lead appointed, and just trying to do that, we ended up with 400 roles to create, which was not an option. We decided to go with something a bit more simplistic, and unfortunately, we we weren't able to align with ISO 19650 when it came to the role. The verbiage, again, around these things are a bit confusing. So trying to scale that to a bunch of people who aren't familiar with ISO 19650 made it a bit more complicated. But we decided to go with a naming convention still, and to use discipline, role, internal or external, and the language. Language code was important to us because we need to standardize everything both in French and in English. Also, the naming convention, the way it works, which made it very easy to adopt, is that you can search for anything. So, for example, _EN in BIM360, and it will give you all the English role. You can search for _BIM manager, will pop up all the BIM manager possible role. The result was a very, very large table, as you can see in the background here. And everything is documented and updated when we make a modification. But this table basically is our template for BIM360. So every new project, if you assign the correct role to the employee, would get the access to the right folder structure and be able to use the ISO 19650 workflow as well. Because one thing that we saw is that BIM360, if you miss the permission, people won't be able to share, won't be able to consume, might not be able to create issues. And this was extremely time consuming. So what we found so far, what are the good, bad, and ugly side of our ISO 19650 implementation? Obviously, not everything went well and smoothly. Some elements were easier to implement and even made our workflow more efficient, but some felt a bit against the grain to try to adopt. So I highlighted the major one. The good was the CDE for the collaboration and exchange. The workflow that was proposed by ISO 19650 was great. The file naming convention that I didn't mention earlier was also something we've implemented on ESAP, and I'm looking forward to implementing more projects. The focus on the digital delivery is a huge plus to ISO 19650 with the focus on information, and it does facilitate the support and mitigate certain risks. The bad so far in the implementation is the terminology, the lack of adoption by the client, and the fact that at the moment it might change with time when we get a bit more, when the market is a bit more in line with ISO 19650, but it doesn't seem to be applicable to all sizes of project. Smaller project tends to take a lot more time upfront, and that time is not always available for those smaller projects. So starting with the good side, we're going to explore that a bit. The ISO 19650 collaboration and exchange process in the CDE was a big plus for us. It does align very well with BIM360. It was easier to implement, so it's a good point to start your implementation of ISO 19650 if it's not already done. And with a bit of time, people started to have a grasp of the concept of publish and archive, which are not necessarily embedded in BIM360, different term, different verbiage, but people did get it. So standardizing the permission and the template also allowed us to have an easier time with clients who didn't necessarily add the correct access for the publish folder, for example, to get their deliverable. So that mitigated a bit the need to have multiple CDE platform over time. The review process as well, within the ISO 19650 saved us a lot of headache, making it a bit more mandatory on project. It does come with a lot of good. Trying to avoid the live linking, for example, by promoting ISO 19650 was a good plus side on our end. The file naming convention that I didn't mention earlier, on ESAP, we did took the UK annex at the time. I think it's still the UK annex. And we implemented the naming convention for the model file only. Every other file type already had a naming convention, but I kind of insisted that for the models, we followed that. We did ended up tweaking it a bit. The volume and level location weren't used because for that project, it would have been XX across the board. It was more for plants, so we used the file type and building section instead. So we used just 5 out of the 7 field. But it was great. It was great to look at your file and just know what it's meant for. So I'm really looking forward to see how we can implement that and make it more of a standard, and maybe realign with ISO 19650, and with time just accept those XX, those ZZ, and keep it as it is for the old project. As mentioned earlier as well, one of the good side was the digitization of our work. It's a huge plus side for the ISO 19650 that focus on the data exchange on our larger project is something we always needed. Having a guideline that emphasizes its use is very good, and it opened new doors and exciting opportunity. As you can see here, we've even started to test out a VR environment with collaborative people in it. And you can see very quickly when you query an element, the data that comes with the element, very similar to what BIM360 can offer as well. When you pick on element, you can see the data. And if you don't model with that in mind, it becomes a bit of a moot point to call your project BIM, to be honest. It becomes a bit of a moot point to try to achieve a BIM project if you don't focus on the information. And the final good sign of ISO 19650 was the support and risk mitigation. It's a very good outcome of the implementation of some aspect. Having a standard in place makes it super easy to jump in a project and quickly understand what went wrong, or to at least follow the step of the information and see where the blockage can be. It also became very useful during RFI to go through our process and go through our BIM execution plan, for example, and ensure that we've found all the client requirements based on our potential answer to those requirements, and issue RFI to the RFP when we didn't found that information. So it was very, very useful in that sense. Now for the bad and ugly side, as mentioned before, the ISO 19650 has kind of a problem with the verbiage in it. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be well adopted yet in Canada. So when you start trying to use those terms for a document, or even just in a discussion with external firm or external parties, or even internal people, when you say, for example, appointing party, they will just look at you very confused. And do you mean the client? What do you mean by appointing party? What do you mean by delivery team? Are you referring to the design team? So we already have very similar term in our industry right now, and rewiring those terms can be a challenge. And unfortunately, we found that it was a bit in the way of adoption of ISO 19650, because for some it felt like we were trying to reinvent the wheel, while ISO has been around for a while now. Another bad thing about it, in my opinion, in Canada, is that we're missing the foundation of ISO 19650 when it comes to the OIR, PIR, EIR, AIR. That's not something that we received structured in that manner. So trying to identify all the client requirement and make sure that we have a clear answer for them is a bit of a challenge. I think at the moment, some client even confuse what a BIM project should be. They just ask for a BIM project, but send no clear requirement. They send, for example, CAD standard. So BIM, in my mind, is a bit confused with VDC. So where I draw the line is VDC is really oriented toward a 3D model, and the information within a VDC project, for me, at least my comprehension, would be more in line with what a contractor would need, the 4D aspect, 5D aspect. But when it comes to a BIM project where we have no requirement for model information, when it comes to engineering or asset or operation or anything, it feels odd a bit to have no information requirement in building information model. So I also think that it's a bit ill-adapted to small project, as I was mentioning earlier. Some of you are probably very familiar with the McLeamy curve, where a bulk of the effort is or should be placed at the front of the project. And when you realize that successfully at the front of the project, the rest of your BIM project will go a lot smoother, because there's going to be less change and less the information will be correct in your model. There's going to be less need for coordination because the space have been reserved, and there's a lot more work and coordination and collaboration that have been done upfront. So for a very small project, having all that process was a challenge. Fortunately enough, we kind of standardized the BIM360 approach quite a lot and speed up that process of implementation. So it does help to have a strong standard, but I still feel it's a bit ill adapted for smaller project. So with this good and bad identified, there are still many areas of ISO 19650 that I would like to explore or refine and include in our workflow. For example, the suitability code are definitely an interesting concept to explore. We have used them in a recent project. We had some struggle to get it right and get everyone on board. It was a rough challenge, but there's a lot of value in using them. And the way it was proposed by our partner was to use it inside of model element instead of using it at the file level. I think there was still a file level suitability code, but each model element needed to have a suitability code, which made a lot of sense, and it was surprisingly refreshing. It was a surprisingly refreshing idea, and it's something that, at first seemed like a lot of effort, but after you've done it, come to realize that it makes a lot of sense. Your model cannot be just all issued for information. Your model will be at different stage at different time, and maybe your west wing will be ready before your east wing, as an example. So I think it was really refreshing to try that, and that's definitely something I want to try to test out and master in the future. There's also the ISO 19650 3 and 5 that for the operational phase and security-minded approach. That's something that I haven't explored much yet, but that's definitely something that I want to approach, because we have a lot of project that required reliability clearance or some sort of clearance to work with, and not all the information can be stored in the cloud. There's some requirement there, so definitely something interesting to investigate. And the operational phase is also something very interesting that I want to understand a bit more, because I want to improve the life cycle of our model, and I'm curious to see where we're gonna try to find a way to migrate from design intent model to construction model and keep the information intact between those two stages, and where we're going to go to operational model and find a way to make use of the construction model, design intent model, merge that in one beautiful package where we truly have a full life cycle model. So very interested in looking into these solutions. Some final thoughts. Now, some of you might be wondering, an engineering firm is creating all of this. It's typically the lead on the project that should investigate or set up the CDE platform, or the contractor. So really what we're trying to do at WSP is to create something where all of our users will be able to communicate with external firm and come up with a unified solution. So I know it's a bit of a utopian vision, but I think that in the future, if we achieve to have a single standard, single way of working between our partnership with others, we're going to just become so much more efficient. So I truly wish that we can achieve that in the future.
So Alex, we're just jumping in here because we're bumming up on the end of our time.
Yeah,
I don't want to cut you off here. I know you.
No, that's fine.
You're pretty close to the end. It looked like you're at your last slide, but we don't have a ton of time for questions. But just one quick question. Do you have an Atari 2600 hooked up to that cathode ray tube TV there? Is that, or a ColecoVision?
Yeah, it's a very old television that I had when I was young.
I'm just messing with you. No, I mean, you hit on something that's very important. I mean, this standard is very applicable for projects over $100 million. You have multiple collaborators, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense to go through this exercise at the beginning of a project to set up these first principles on a project that size, because it's so impactful. And obviously on a $1 million project, it could be very onerous. So in your opinion, where is this? Do you think that curve will be lower in the future, where this gets easier and everyone's more accustomed to implementing this standard and it gets used on all projects of all sizes? Or is there a sweet spot, $10 million and above or $50 million and above, where you think that this type of organization, this type of framework is very applicable?
That's a very good question. I think it can be applicable to most projects, but not all of ISO 19650. You gotta, on smaller project, for example, the CDE solution, that's something you can implement. Naming convention, you can implement it. BIM Execution Plan, what I would suggest is you sit down with a client and you have a typical one for all of his small project. Mm-hmm. So the expectations are clear at the beginning of the project. You don't spend time trying to elaborate and search for the requirements.
But so it's really dependent on the team, I guess, and their experience with using the framework, where you think that sort of sweet spot for applicability would be with project size.
It's hard to tell on the project size. I cannot put a number to it. It's really going to depend on what the client wants to achieve. If he has a very small project but high requirement, then the price will go up. In any case,
or if they say it's a nuclear project where they've already implemented it on all of their work, regardless of project size, they want their data structured in a certain way.
Yeah.
So WSP is a massive entity working on many projects all over the world. What's your perspective on different markets? Are some of them more advanced with this standard, and on what percentage of your work here in Canada are you actually implementing this?
We're starting to use it as a standard in our building project at the moment. There's a lot of interest from wastewater, for example, and the more linear structure. They're interested in some aspect of our work. There's going to be a need for tweak because the platform won't be the same. But I think the workflow itself, it's just it's a framework, so it can be used in any discipline.
Right on. Okay. Well, maybe we'll wrap it up there. Really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure you'd be open to people reaching out to you directly about your presentation. So thank you for that in advance. And
absolutely.
We're going to take a break here, give everyone the opportunity to take advantage of the networking capability of our platform. So we're going to break until probably about 2:45. So come back into the main stage here at that point. But in the meantime, I encourage you to go into the system here and meet up with some of your peers. There's over 500 professionals participating in this event. So yeah, reach out to them, have some conversations, meet some people, and we'll reconvene at 2:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you.